Hey everyone, back doing more recaps from Network Field Day 33, Day 1. So, next I'm going to talk about Cisco and really talking more about Meraki. I still like to, call them Meraki. I think they're still trying to, maybe bring it all under the Cisco one name, but I'll always try and identify them differently as a standout unit. So, everything was Meraki today. And the thing that they talked about up front was which there's nothing new here. This has actually been out for a while. Are the 9300s, the Catalyst 9300s, and getting those into the Meraki dashboard so that you can manage and monitor them from there. I think that was actually announced at Cisco Live or shortly before Cisco Live. And it's really interesting to see how far they've taken it. Now it's gotten to the point where they're actually shipping 9300s with the Meraki firmware loaded on them. So it's not as if you have to do a conversion process. You can also, I don't want to say, we'll say swap out the firmware. I was about to say downgrade, but we'll say swap out the firmware if you're not going to use it in Meraki. Or the other way around, if you have a 9300 that you're bringing into Meraki. But it is really interesting just to see that there's enough demand in there for them to just start shipping them with the Meraki firmware by default. And I think it makes a lot of sense for organizations who maybe they're not trying to necessarily get to automation, because it's not like, if you have Meraki, it's automation. It's definitely orchestration in there as far as pushing changes out and things like that. But the idea that this higher end hardware, the 9300 as a platform, has gotten to the point where ease of management in a Meraki style has become in such demand that they put this together, that they created this. And I don't know, I just think it's really interesting that we're at that point, because when you think about Meraki, or at least when I think about Meraki in more of the historical sense, it's always been the small branch office, 12 ports, 16 ports. It's the all-in-one device, and it's got the access point inside it as well. But to see that they're actually starting to grow that out and get into the 9300 platform and ship hardware with the 9300 in place, it's an interesting shift. We'll see. They listed a bunch of the 93s that they have out there. They that was just a really cool update. Also had some other smaller hardware updates in there as far as some switches, smaller switches where they have more ports on them. Definitely seeing more MGig out there, like switches that are full MGig on every single port. It's not just 16, and it's not just for your access points. So when you start thinking about, okay, well, do I really need MGig out to my clients, out to my desktops? You might. Depends on the organization, depends on the vertical. I could definitely see engineering firms or anyone who's dealing with drawings, like CAD type drawings along those lines. Hey, maybe having a 5 gig port or a 2.5 gig port at the desktop without having to go to, necessarily 10 gig over fiber and 10 gig over copper and pay the fee for that. That if you start getting into the higher end connectivity for desktops, there are a lot of organizations out there that would really like that. So I think that's actually been happening with the regular Catalyst 9300s as well. That's not necessarily unique to the Meraki variants. But just in general, I really like the idea that we're seeing switches that are completely MGig, or this 1 through 48 are MGig. There was another switch that they talked about that was Meraki, which is their first ruggedized switch. And it has a lot of the things that you would expect within a rugged switch. So it's a DIN mount. You're using one of those external DIN mount power supplies to power it. It can run super hot. It can run super cold. Cisco even did this thing, or Meraki did this thing where they had employees take them home and see who could trigger the alarms first. Like who could run it hot enough to trip the alarm, who could get it cold enough to trip the alarm, which is just interesting to see that sort of engagement with them, with their employees. But the thing that really caught my attention in there was that it's not a replacement for the IE4000 style switches, like those industrial switches that you see in a lot of manufacturing. I know that's where I've encountered them before, are manufacturing environments. Like you don't have the ability to turn off spanning tree and run rep ring. So they're, again, that came back to manufacturing for me. So it's not a full, like I said, it's not a full IE 4000 replacement. And really what this is meant for are the environments. They're just the harsher environments, but they're not really ready for the more dedicated, the more business tied to things like manufacturing. Like they're just not ready to take that place. So if you need, basically, if you need a switch and you need it to run really, really hot or really, really cold, it's going to be outside somewhere. Put it in an enclosure, and you can run one of these Meraki ruggedized switches. So that's pretty cool. The last thing they talked about was more of the security side with Meraki, and how we're starting to see more features added into that space. So if you've ever seen an SD Access presentation from Cisco, you'll see them talk about how you can set up the different SGTs, the security group tags, and start using those to map, okay, who can talk to who within your network. Are you an end user? Do you need to talk directly to a file server that houses HR information, or are you a payment machine, a processing endpoint? Do you need to talk to anything but the internet? So if you go and you watch one of those, any of those SD Access conversations, that's essentially what we talked about, but for Meraki. And I don't mean to necessarily minimize it, because it's great to see that Meraki is saying, hey, we see that security need out there. We see people answering it within the Catalyst lineups and SD Access and DNAC and DNA Center. But to bring that functionality over to Meraki, I think is a bit of a statement from Cisco, is that within Meraki, they're going to continue to take it more seriously, bring in the functions, the security functions that are needed to really make the platform more acceptable in more places within the business. So it's good to see that they're continuing to put that development into Meraki, that you're going to be able to do some of those similar actions. One thing that I had questioned them on specifically about this point was, all right, well, are my policies different? So I have SD Access and I'm running it through ICE, and it's doing all of this matrixing of who can talk to who. What do I have to do to get that to work on Meraki? And thankfully the answer was not much. So it's not as if it's using some separate control plane or some completely different method. I feel like if this was 10 years ago, that we'd see the Catalyst having one way of doing it, and then Meraki having a completely different, non-compatible, non-exportable way of doing it. But it sets a trend, a theme from Cisco that speaks to interoperability between platforms. And then you can extend that out even to ACI in some regards as well. So sort of tying those platforms together with ICE and seeing that movement, I view that very much as a positive. So those were the three topics that we had hit with Cisco. It was a really good conversation. When I found out we were only going to be talking about Meraki, I just kind of figured, oh, okay, it's going to be some new hardware. But the software bits in there definitely made that conversation more robust and more enjoyable than I thought it was going to be going into it. So that was Cisco. Thank you for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.